Welcome to Just Break Up, the podcast about love, heartbreak, and all the relationship advice you don't want to hear. My name is Sierra DeMulder.
And I'm Sam Blackwell. And today, we're not going to answer a letter because today we are going to be talking about Sierra and her upcoming book of poetry called Ephemera, which is coming out in June.
That's so exciting. And when you were talking, I was picturing you being like, and today we're talking about Sierra and about her upcoming divorce and, you know, like house, but, you know, like
separation,
anything that I would like, we're not answering a letter from a listener. We're answering a letter from Sierra where Sam just gives her life advice.
If you're interested in more content
kidding.
like that, you can always support us on Patreon.
I'm not getting divorced, just so you know.
That's definitely not happening.
Yes, so today we're going to talk about my brand new poetry book that's coming out in June. And I just want to say, like, I know this is a little bit outside of our normal content. We've been doing this show for almost 5 years this summer, and I've never, you know, like taken over the driver's seat of the podcast to talk about my other work. I'm just going to do it this one time in celebration of my new book coming out, and Sam gets to live out his Terry Gross NPR fantasy by interviewing me about my book, and I'll read some poems, and we'll have some conversations about it, which is so exciting to us as English majors. I don't know about you, but I think this is very cute and fun.
Oh, no, absolutely. As I was coming up with questions, I was like, you actually also have to ask questions about Sierra and not just like English majory questions about the themes in the book. No. Let's get nerdy with it. Before we get into it, I just want to start by, again, like thanking our listeners for supporting this like other side of my career. Even just by listening to this episode, you're supporting us. But if you're interested, especially after you hear some of my book today in this episode, my wonderful publisher, Button Poetry, is offering a 15% off discount code for anyone who wants to buy a copy of my book, Ephemera. It's available for pre-order now, but it's coming out in June 2023. And for the whole month of April, by the way, it's April now, happy National Poetry Month. For the whole month of April, this coupon code is running. It's Just Break Up, all one word, and you'll get 15% off. And I'm sure there's a link in the show notes. You can also go to my socials or our website, or just look up Button Poetry or Ephemera by Sierra DeMulder. Use code Just Break Up for 15% off my book that I'm going to be reading from today. Okay, so do you want to start with a poem or a question? Well, I thought it would be good for us to just start out with like a basic question about your career in poetry, right? Because I think that there's like some folks know you as a poet, and lots of our listeners probably just know you as a podcast host. So like, can you talk about your career in poetry, what it's meant to you, and sort of how you got to the point where you were ready to write another book?
Yeah, oh my God, I just got like a little nervous. But like, when's the last time I felt nervous talking to you? Like probably when we worked together in the coffee shop and you thought I was a bitch. Okay, so my poetry career, before I ever started Just Break Up with Sam and Spencer, I was a full-time poet. And I say full-time poet. You can be a poet, you know, employed or not. But I always said full-time because I felt like I had to qualify the fact that it was the only job that I had. I was very lucky to be able to make money off of my career. It started back, oh my gosh, I'm almost 37. It started when I was 20. I started going to open mics and poetry slams, and I became like obsessed with this, you know, spoken word art form, which eventually matured into just a love for the written word in any form. And my career definitely did start in the spoken word / poetry slam world, which, if you don't know, is like competitive poetry readings. I won the National Poetry Slam twice, in 2009 and 2010. And that's a international poetry competition in which it's kind of like March Madness for literary nerds, where like you qualify for a local team, and then that local team goes to nationals, and then you compete against other poets.
It's like forensics in high school.
Yes, totally, exactly. It's a lot like that, honestly. So I did that, and through performing and competing on these bigger national stages, I not only like grew my writing community and my repertoire, but I grew a venue of people who wanted to read and listen to my work. This is like, my career started really taking off or growing at the very beginnings of YouTube and YouTube poetry online. I actually missed that wave of a lot of spoken word being put out online. My career came up a little bit before it. But yeah, so just like sort of serendipitously with the publication of my first couple books and me winning and performing on these big national stages, I grew a readership, and Ephemera, the book I'm reading from today, will be my 5th book, but I haven't published anything since like 2017. So it's pretty exciting to come back to poetry in this way, because honestly, when we started the podcast and it sort of blew up on its own, I fell so in love with the podcasting world that I kind of thought I would never come back to the writing world. And then like life happened and brought me back here. So yeah, that's like a very airy, brief description of my writing career. But yeah, I spent years making my income traveling to different colleges and universities and high schools and giving readings there, performances, workshops. I founded and ran a high school writing camp for high school poets for 7 years, and it was the curriculum director for that. And yeah, just sort of like I always called it like a collage of work that was surrounded by or was focused on poetry, whether that was like teaching or performing or publishing more books and whatnot.
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah. And as like somebody who has been, obviously I didn't know you were when you were 20, because I was just a wee child. So like we couldn't hang out, but like it has been fun, from like the first days of like going with you to like poetry slams in St. Paul and being like, what is this? And why are all these people so sad and angry all the time? So like sort of seeing this like big moment has
becoming
been really...
a sad, angry person yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Has been like, it's been beautiful to sort of see this, I wouldn't even call it growth, but just like this like adaptation that you've gone through from where you were to like now who you are and how you approach poetry. Because this book is like really different from your first book or your third book, right? Like it's just, and I think like from my experience as an outsider, I've seen you write these books, and like some of them have been like, yep, I'm going to compile a bunch of poems together and it's going to be like a book. And some of them have been like, I am tearing this out of my soul because like there's something in here that needs to get out. And it feels like this book is the latter, where it's like there's something that like needs to be extricated from your body. And I'm curious, like, can you tell us about the book, what it's about, and like why it was important for you to write it?
That's a great question. And I think you're totally right. I felt less of the, like, I need to get this off my chest, like tear it out of my body, and more like I had put my pen down. I'd stepped away from my writing career to really pursue our podcast and other life things. And then life happened, and I needed to process my life through poetry. I needed to process it. I needed to go back to poetry for the original reason I had started writing, which was for a cathartic release, for like, so that I could write about something so I could better understand it. And so this book was really, you're right. The last book I published, Today Means Amen, which was published in 2017, I was offered that publishing deal, and they basically asked for 40 poems, and I just had to like compile 40 of my last poems, okay. Yep. And so that was much more of like let me see what's here. Whereas this book was written because it needed to be written, and because I wanted to I wanted to record what was going on in my life. And compiling this book was really enjoyable for me because I knew that there was these underlying themes, but I didn't know until I had all of the poems in conversation with one another. And then I saw this arc of, the themes of the book are a lot about death and time and new life and queer love. And the title Ephemera means something that is only enjoyed for a small amount of time. And I think as you move through life, Sharon Olds says, the older you get, the more you feel. And the older I get, the harder life gets and the more enjoyable it gets at the same time. So I think I wanted to capture a lot of that as well as like process some of the things that I was going through. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes, it does. Absolutely. That's great.
Good.
Cool. Well, why don't you read us one of the poems from the book?
Yeah, I will. So I'll talk a little bit more about the sections of the book, but I'm going to start with a poem that I think our listeners will enjoy, but also that really, to me, captures the urgent essence of the book that I was writing. And it talks about you in the very first line. So this is called New Vows. When my best friend got married, he walked down the aisle to a song about death. Isn't that what marriage is about? He laughed. A promise to be together until one of you dies. I regret my wedding vows. Too focused on the benign, our boundless laughter, how I cherish just waking up together. I should have said, I take thee and all the treachery that aliveness guarantees. I should have said, I will help bury your elders. I take your hand and your heart murmur, the cancerous growth above your father's ear. I take your family history of alcoholism and give you back a possible covenant of dementia, miscarriage, high blood pressure, in sickness and in car accidents, in sickness and in the mundane, shared calendars and anniversaries spent arguing about our budget. You told me once, Great Danes have a short life expectancy, only 6 to 10 years if you're lucky. And I cried, who would sign up to love something so impermanent? Oh, beloved, we have been so happy lately, it's making us nervous. And isn't that what marriage is all about? A love so darling, so hallowed and exposed, we both volunteer to be its keeper. When the joy runs dry, when the body fails, not because, but in glorious spite of the unpalatable, impossible fact that someday one of us will wake up first, only to find ourselves alone. And that's that.
Beautiful. It's weird to listen to you say it without hearing other people in the room go, after every line. So it was like, am I supposed to be quiet or like?
It's always awkward in a reading. It's honestly, it's awkward in a reading with an audience too, because then you're done and you're like, okay, thanks. And people don't know if they should clap or snap or yeah, sure, exactly. Sure. So you're good. We'll just move on.
I love that poem, first of all, because I'm in it and I love any poem in which I am mentioned. And secondly,
yep.
You and I have talked about this all the time. Like that last line of that poem where it's like one of us is going to agree to wake up early and be alone, right? Or be the only one. It's like this idea of...
It gives me chills. Yeah.
I know, being in relationship with people and committing to being in a relationship with people means that like at some point you're going to be the only one. Like one of you is going to die. But it's interesting because like a lot of this book is about like death leading into life and then like celebrations of life also being tied to their eventual end, right? And sort of this cycle that we're constantly in. That's not even a cycle because they're like both happening at the same time. So can you talk a little bit about like why these sort of themes of new life, beginnings, as well as endings and death were important for you to talk about or important for you to create these poems about?
Well, you said it perfectly right there. It's that they are always there. They are happening in tandem with one another. And truly, the true vulnerability that is required of us is to know that they're both happening all the time. That to love something is to know that it will end one day, because everything ends. And to accept your end, to accept death and suffering and the cruelty and chaotic nature of the universe, is to also know that your joy is so important and your happiness is so important, and your love and your ability to love in spite of that inevitable end is that much more precious. And I said before that this book sort of like required itself to be written, and I wrote the first poems of it when my grandmother was dying. The first section of the book is all about endings. I like that the book moves from death to new life, but we'll talk about that later.
I noticed that.
Thank you. And it starts and ends with two poems called Waiting, and they're about waiting for death and waiting for new life. But so, I wrote the very first poems that ended up being in this book when I was taking care of my mother on hospice, my grandmother on hospice. And within the same day, your father died, and you called me to tell me that he had passed. And for uncomparable reasons, you and I were irrevocably changed by that month.
For sure.
For sure,
absolutely.
We really, and you were newly married, and I was newly with who would end up being my wife. And it just was such high highs and low lows. And I think that's where I really, I felt like I grew up that month. And I felt like I entered adulthood that month, and that adulthood was about accepting those peaks and valleys, and you can't run from either of them. You can't run exclusively into the suffering. You can't just say like, oh, the world just is awful, because it is. It is. And it also is so beautiful and fragile and joyful. And it is that, but it's not that without the other. So, and I guess the last thing I'll say is like that life lesson that we learned, that terrible January was like continued to be learned, I think, again and again over the next couple of years, which also happened to be some of the happiest years of my life. So that duality was just so unignorable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's interesting for me to read this book as somebody who like knows you and your life so well, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting to like read through it and be like, oh, I know exactly the moment that she's talking about in this. But I also think that like the beauty of this book is the ways in which you have learned important lessons through those experiences that are also like really universal, right? Like this sort of,
yes.
What I would say is that like reading this book feels to me like you've put words to a truth that I have learned over the course of the last 3 years that I could not comprehend before all of this stuff happened, right? Where your grandmother dying, my dad dying, right? Like that horrible year that we sort of went through. That was also like a beautiful year because like Peter and I moved into our home, and you and Willow like moved in together, and like all of this like really wonderful stuff. And I love the way that you're talking about it as being like, this was a book that needed to be written, because it does feel like you and I, through the course of making this podcast as well, have like come to a different understanding of like what truth is. And what it is all of these different things at the same time, right? It's about life, death, birth, renewal, like all of those things are happening at the same time. So it's just like, it was profound to read it so beautifully put in this book. So thank you for that.
That is so nice, Sam. I really appreciate hearing that. And that, I think that is what poetry does, is it takes these specific moments, like this specific, something that's only specific to my life, and then someone else is able to read it and see a bigger universal truth or see their life reflected in it. I'll take that as a transition to the next poem that you also know about.
Let's do it.
This poem is called The Day of Your Proposal, after Nicole Seeley. We drop fresh-cut strawberries into glasses of champagne and draw an impossibly hot bath that turns our skin pink. My back to one side, yours to the other, our legs bowed into a constellation. It is here in the water where we have named our unborn children, plotted the next overambitious house project, plated the hours in hopes time would slow just a little. You are giving me so much more than a hyphenated name. We have built a new astrology, a celestial porch light, a love as simple as a front door. You are the home that made all other homes just thresholds, holding pens from one blunder to the next until it was renamed. Forgive me, but I will always want more time. Forgive me, but I hope I die first. You know, I just realized, sorry, that's the end of the poem, but I just realized, like, if I had some more, like, foresight, I probably wouldn't have read those poems back to back because they both end with, like,
death,
me dying alone or my wife. Yeah. And this book is not, there's like a large handful of love poems in it or like poems about my wife and my life, but I didn't mean to read two of them back to back, but
so that's okay. That's good. That. And actually, like, that's a perfect segue to the question that I have, because like, one of my favorite things about this book, it's about life and death and birth and all of these different things. And it's also just full of love poems, which is like really wonderful and charming to read. And like, it's so nice to know that those love poems are about Willow, who I like also love. And I'm excited to see her like get some wonderful attention.
Not like my other exes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's like interesting too, to like compare it to some of the previous work that like that is maybe most well known from people, which is like Paper Dolls or like Unrequited Love Poem, right? Which are like these poems that are very beautiful and profound and like also necessary poems, but are not about what it feels like to just be in love with someone. And it was like really fun as a reader of your like work to be like, oh, this is so nice that it's this beautiful, lovely, wonderful poem about this person who's like really lovely and wonderful. So I'm just like curious about like, what is it like to write love poems to someone that you like really like, that maybe have like death at the end, but are just about like how happy and excited you are to be in relationship with them?
Yeah. I have two thoughts. The first one is I swear to God, this is true. I wasn't like looking at my reviews, although like that's totally something that's fine to do. But I stumbled upon some early reviews of this book, even though it's not out yet. It's like, you know, special galley copies go out to people requesting reviews. And I saw some reviews for the book on Goodreads and I was like, oh my God, it's out in the world. Oh my God. And I read them and one person was like, it's so nice to see a writer write about them finding happiness after they wrote about being sad for so long.
That's what I'm saying. I think that's what I'm trying to tell you. It's like, I've read a lot of your work and like, this is like, it's so nice to be like, oh, she's happy.
I think he wrote it in like a more eloquent way than that, but that was essentially the gist of it. The second thing I'll say is when you were talking, a poem by Mary Oliver comes to mind. It's called The Whistler, and it's about like how she lived with her wife for so many years. And all of a sudden she heard her wife whistling in the house and she didn't know she lived with a whistler. She didn't know she loved someone who whistled. And that's the poem. That's what it's about.
Oh, that's very cute.
I think of that when you ask me, what is it like to write from inside love, I guess, or, you know, or about a love that is present. It feels like simultaneously like simpler and more complicated because you have to find a way to talk about something you know so intimately and that's so precious and revered to you in a way that other people will connect to. I also think it was powerful for me to write unabashedly about loving Willow because, to be honest, this is the first book of 5 that I am openly out as a queer person. And that is almost like mildly shameful for me to admit. Like I feel a little ashamed, but it also feels euphoric to say that I am unabashedly myself, unapologetically myself, and unapologetically in love with my wife in this book. A couple things come to mind, like my very, very first book I think it was published in 2010. There are poems about Willow in that book because we dated for the first time in 2007, but you wouldn't know it because I hid behind, I changed pronouns. I hid behind the neutral you, in my love poems. And it felt safer that way. It felt easier even to like chameleon in and out of that heteronormativity. And I did that for years. And it just feels like a gift to myself to like, well, her love feels like a gift. And so to write about it unabashedly in this way feels so good.
The whole of the sort of love story element of this book is like it's unabashedly queer, and it's also very like everyday in its queerness, right? It's not necessarily even about like some sort of big political story, although it is because of its very existence, right? The fact that we're talking about queer love is inherently political because it's been politicized. But like, it's also just about like your connection in the everyday aspect of what it's like to live in a queer couple together. And like, I think that's really beautiful. And like one of my favorite poems is Sex While Pregnant, which is about you trying to have queer sex while pregnant. And it's just so lovely and wonderful. And like, yeah, absolutely. It's not necessarily telling a bigger story about something that like some sort of universal truth. It's just like, here's an experience that I've had as a queer person living a very queer everyday life, which I think is just so wonderful.
You know what? I'm going to read a poem in a couple poems. I'm not going to read it yet. In which I say, blessings to my wife for how she helped me. And I even remember like, man, heteronormativity is quite the fucking drug, because I remember writing that and being like, are people going to connect to this poem if I talk about pregnancy and refer to my wife and I'm the person, like people are so obsessed with gender and heteronormativity that even I, writing about my personal pregnancy loss and pregnancy and lived experience, I remember like, I guess it was like a heteronormative narrator in my head saying like, oh no, you should change that to make it more universal. And the universal always is heteronormativity, right? Isn't that fucked up?
Yep.
So I didn't. I remember being like, no, this is my wife. This is a story about me and my queer wife in my queer fucking marriage with my queer pregnancy loss,
Yep.
And I think that's what the book is for me. You're so right that it's not political. It has been politicized. And it was just it was scary and euphoric for me to be totally in love with my queer life in this book.
Absolutely. Scary and euphoric is the best like intersection to sit at.
Okay, I will, I'll read another poem to keep us going. So this book, I said it's in sections, and the third and fourth section, the second half of the book, really deal with my ectopic pregnancy, as our listeners know about. And I'm going to read a poem from that third section. And this in like, if we were thinking about this book linearly in time, this would be after my ectopic, and before I became pregnant with my now daughter. So I was sort of sitting in this weird place of grief and resentment and fear and, infertility, really, not knowing what was going to happen to me next, because I needed a special medical assistance to get pregnant outside of just the normal assistance that two queer people need.
Sure.
Okay, so this poem is called "We're Having a Baby." She says, but you swore you'd never be like them. The women on the blogs and the message boards who talk about skipping their own sister's shower or canceling plans with friends who only know how to talk about their kids, or the one woman who confessed to screaming at the drugstore cashier who was handing out roses on Mother's Day. No, I'll never be like them, you thought, until you found yourself sitting across the table from a beaming couple and you coughed your congratulations flimsy as gauze, and you mean it. Of course you mean it. But you thought you'd never be that woman, jealous as a toddler, made stingy by grief. Tell the readers it was you at the drugstore who saw the bucket of roses individually wrapped like syringes, 100 tiny dancers blushing proud after their first recital. And it's not true, is it? You didn't scream after all. And that, too, is a part of your story, the silence of it. Being offered something blooming and saying, no, not me, not yet.
So I love that poem. And I think it sort of speaks to one of the big themes that is coming up in those sort of the sections 3 and sections 4, which is about silence and about not being able to find the right words to say the things, right? Or, like there's another poem that you have, and it's If Miscarriage Was a Word, and you sort of talk about like, what would that mean? And one of the things you say is a name whispered in prayers or dragged out of the broken bellows of a mother when told she isn't one, right? Which is like this thing about like language, silence. How do we talk about the reality of what's going on? And I'm curious about like, finding the right words seems to be something that you've struggled with in this book, right? Through the poems that you've talked about. And do you feel like what you landed on, what you've created here, is a way for you to say the words that you haven't been able to say to yourself or to other people?
That's a great question. I do feel like if someone has experienced any infertility or miscarriage or even the longing to become a parent and they haven't yet, I think I have touched on something, because that experience it's so common, like 1 in 4, 1 in 6 people have a miscarriage. Ectopics are much less common than that, but pregnancies ending, that is not a uncommon thing, except for it feels so nebulous because we don't know how to talk about it. We don't know how to carry on everyday conversations about this thing that happens every day to people, all over the world and in all different types of bodies and relationships. And I do feel like I carved out some sort of language for myself that other people could resonate with. I think the hardest, well, there were so many hard things about that experience, but one of the hard things was that I felt like there weren't conversations that I could go to. When you have a miscarriage or when you lose a pregnancy, everybody wants to know the details and nobody wants to talk about it. Or when you go through a tragedy, everybody wants to know, oh my God, well, how did they pass? Or what happened? Or what did they say? Or what did it feel like? They want to know the details. And then they don't want to hear anything else after that. And I think, you could speak to this as well, like grief and moving past trauma. There's this weird stage where people are moving on and you feel like still stuck. You feel stuck in this place where like the world is going on and conversations are happening about the mundane weather, and you are screaming inside. You're literally screaming inside. And also you don't want to talk about it. You want it to be over. At this point, this is a 100% true story about our friends telling us that they were pregnant. And I tried so hard to hide it, but I had a physical reaction when they said that. I was so uncovered when they said that. I didn't know the wound was so there still.
Yep.
And they said, we're having a baby. And I said, oh my God, congrats. I'm so glad that Willow was there to like cover for me. I I hope that those poems in this section put some sound and words into that silence that some people feel afterwards.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's the reality of the like ineptitude of language too, right? Because even finding the words to describe it doesn't get at what it feels like underneath those words too, right? So like, you can define what a miscarriage is. You can define what an ectopic pregnancy is. You can even find the right words when you're telling your friends like, oh, I'm so excited that you're having a baby. But like the inability of that language to actually convey the depth of feeling that goes into it, right? Like, what is the word ectopic when it has all of this like baggage behind it, right? Like, what a stupid word for such a complex like experience, right? Like, and I just think it's really, it's the same thing like where like suicide, right? Where it's like, he committed suicide, and it's like, that's not all that happened, right? Like, there's a whole shit ton of stuff underneath that's going unsaid. And when people just say it, it seems like they know what they're saying, and it's like, you don't. Like, there's so much more that you're like missing because you haven't experienced it, right? So that's what I was really struck by reading this book, or this section particularly, was like, it felt to me, and I'm obviously projecting my own experiences on you, but like, it felt to me like you were trying to find a way to express the unexpressible about this experience, right? Where language was failing you in so many ways because it is incomplete. It cannot get to the actual emotions, experiences, despair that happens, that is so inarticulatable. Whatever. That's a word I'm saying now. But
Yep.
But I'm just like, I'm curious if that is part of this for you, if that's sort of this experience of writing this book and why it's been meaningful for you to put this out into the world.
Well, and as an artist too, like, I wrote these poems, like I said, before I knew this book existed. I wrote these poems when I was healing from this, I think you would relate to this too. Like, it's not just that I lost a pregnancy. It's that life devastated me. And you have to, it's like, I feel like I got over the pregnancy loss faster than I got over my shock and distrust of the universe. Do you know what I mean? Like, I felt so broken open by this because it could happen again, because and this speaks again to the themes of the book, of that, like, my joy yet again was made to feel that much more precious and fragile. And this actually leads well into the next poem, because the final section of the book is about becoming pregnant finally with our daughter, and that experience and what it felt like moving through the world, growing our baby after loss, and all while inhabiting this feeling of extreme impermanence and extreme joy and extreme fear. There are things in life that change the way you move through life. And I think this book is all about that movement, I guess. So I'll go into the next poem, which is the first poem in the last section, about you'll see. It's called My First Second Carried. And if I must, I'll give thanks for the loss. The embryo that grew no bigger than a blueberry, the 4 scars notched across my belly, the liter of blood the doctor vacuumed from me like a vampiric pool boy. I'll say a blessing for each stitch, how they dissolved inside me, silent as a summer frost, and the skin for how it closed like hands in prayer, the hands of true believers that don't unclasp before the last amen. I'll even give thanks to my organs and the terrifying fact that we can often live without them. Blessings to the spouse for how she held me. Blessings to the couch for how it held me as the pity-clipped flowers sent to our house in flocks dried up around me. I'll be grateful for even this, the wilting, the small common deaths around us. If I must, I'll give it all again. My bodily wholeness, my blood, just a penance, a sacrament, a levy on the road to you.
This was my favorite poem in the book.
Oh, that is so nice.
Yes. And, I think part of it is because as somebody who has been through grief, right? Like this promise of something coming of it is like so wonderful, right? And it doesn't always happen. Doesn't always it's not always that clean, right? But like this idea of changing this horrible thing that happened into something that is full of promise and love and offering us a new perspective or a new beginning of something different. So I'm curious about how you are like approaching this sort of idea of all of this stuff led you to this moment where you got to have this baby and it's beautiful and wonderful and she's very cute. And I just got to see her this morning, right? Like, how do you sort of hold all of that in your head and your heart, this idea that like this had to happen in order for this to happen? And like, and I'm just curious, like where the edges and boundaries are around that idea for you.
Well, I think it makes me think of the country classic, God Bless the Broken Road that led me home to you or whatever. But in sincerity, I think a lot of this book was trying to live in between those things. Like, I would do it all over again, and I would never want to. I would never want to put anyone through these losses that we've been talking about today. I think it's trying to shift away from the mentality of I needed to check off these suffering boxes to get to the good thing. It's not that. It's not so linear. Right. It's again, the idea that these things are happening in tandem, whether we welcome them in our hearts or not. When you are your happiness, there is also suffering. And when you are your most depraved and sad and frustrated and hurt by the world, there is also joy. And so this poem for me was an acknowledgement of both, that hazy, painful time of my life, the details of that all did lead to her, did lead to my baby. And it's not about saying I had to go through that to get to this. It's saying these things are happening at the same time, that all of these things are for me and my storyline and my life, that my life will guaranteed include extreme suffering, maybe suffering that I have not even experienced yet, and it's going to include this great joy made only greater because of the suffering that was experienced before I met her, I don't think of it, even though it's funny in the line I say a penance. I don't think of it as this grand. I don't think I had to pay this price to meet her, but would I pay it again? Yes.
Yeah.
That's maybe what I want to say. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it's like it's a hard road to sort of walk, because there is this idea of like, if this horrible thing hadn't happened to me, I wouldn't know the things that I know now. And I'm grateful for them, right? Like those are so helpful.
You do get perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. But I would never wish this on anyone, like I would never want somebody to have to go through this in order to have this perspective. And at the same time, this horrible thing was a teacher, right? I learned something new about myself and the world.
Yes.
And I don't think that it's necessarily like a through line of like, you had to have this experience in order for you to have Temple. But I do think that like this idea of this suffering has changed your perspective and relationship to her inherently.
Yes.
Because of the things that you've gone through. And like, that doesn't mean that you love her. It doesn't mean that you love her more or less than you would have without this experience, but it definitely means you love her differently.
Oh, totally. Well, and if you go back mentally or replay the very first poem I opened with, that poem is actually in the third section of my book. And I wrote it when I was pregnant and nobody knew I was pregnant. I wrote it, and there's a line in there that says, talking about Great Danes having such a short life expectancy. And I say, who would sign up to love something so impermanent? And then I say, we have, and there's a line break, and the line is, we have been so happy lately. It's making us nervous. And it is the idea that, like, again, it is the title of the book, Ephemera, that we are only here for such a short time, and that we are all, willing or unwilling, signing up to love something so impermanent, to love something so beautifully fragile and complicated and nuanced, because we don't have another choice, really.
For sure. That's right. No, I mean, that's it. Like, we don't have another choice. Like, that's the beauty of all of the stuff that we've been talking about, right? Like, first of all, that the things that we love are going to pass, right? And we don't have a choice in that. So, like, let's be honest about it. But then also the beauty of the idea that we are choosing to love despite the fact that we know that it will hurt us at some point, right? Like,
right. That one day soon, one of us will wake up and find ourselves alone. That's the whole. That's why I chose to start with that poem, because the whole idea of this book is showing up anyway, and holding space for both.
For sure.
So I'll do one more poem. But before, I'll just say there are other themes in this book. You know, there are love poems, but there are also poems about, you know, relationships ending and queerness in itself, and how that shows up in my family. There's poems about death and grief and helping my family through that time. So this is my favorite poem in the book. I read yours and I'll read mine.
Perfect.
And everything in this poem is true. It's called The Fawn. A week before a doctor transferred you from the studied care of an embryologist through a loaded catheter into my uterus, a friend told me about her dream. 3 deer, 2 does and a fawn hovering at the edge of her property. She said, "I think it's your baby telling us she is close." The day before I took a pregnancy test, I saw 2 wandering on the side of the road, spotted and small, their delicate hooves like dark ballet slippers. I wondered if it was you, and the one taken from my body too soon, or perhaps too late, returned only to shepherd you home. The morning I told my father I was pregnant, another fawn stepped boldly from the woods to watch us curiously from across the pond. At first, I thought it was you, the daughter still growing in my womb as I write this, come to see us before the soldering of soul and body. But now, I believe it was her again, the lost sibling on the other side of time and blood, watching us from behind 1,000 unrewindable moments in another world where I cannot reach her, where all unfinished things dwell. And that's the book. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Thank you so much for doing this.
No, absolutely. Well, and I just like, you talked a little bit about this, but this book starts with a death and ends with a life, right? And like,
yes.
I think that this poem like sort of encapsulates the ways in which these like themes are moving forward. And I'm just curious, like, why start with death and end with life? Like, what were you trying to say there?
You know, I have a not exciting answer to that.
Okay, great. I love it. It just happened. It was an accident.
Yes. Well,
and this is why English majors are stupid.
So
like,
at the beginning of this interview, I said I collected my books. I collected the poems to create this book, and I sort of laid them out. And I saw the themes. I saw the story I was telling, which is that life and death are in tandem, and that joy and suffering are intertwined, and you cannot disconnect them. And I saw that because I put out the poems linearly first. I put them in a timeline, and it started with poems. The oldest poems in the book are about my grandmother dying. And so the first section of the book are poems about endings. There are poems about abortion. There are poems about breakups. There are poems about death in it and end of life, hospice care. And then I had this whole other section about poems about my pregnancy. And I put them as far away from each other as possible. And then, of course, the poems about ectopic had to come before that. And so then it just sort of happened naturally. But the cool thing is, I made a quick reference to this before. I ordered the book. And it wasn't until after I handed the book into the publisher that I noticed the very first poem is called Waiting. And it's about what we do while we're waiting for death. And the very last poem, except for a bonus poem that you will see if you buy the book, the very last poem is called Waiting as well. And it's about waiting for our daughter to be born. And I wrote it 2 days before our baby was born. So yeah, it's just the life cycle appeared to me.
For sure.
I had very little to do with it.
Yeah, you didn't even get to pick it. It just picked itself for you, which is also a wonderful thing to think about.
Yes, totally.
Well, everyone buy this book. It's really good. I mean, it's worth buying for the last secret poem that Sierra's like alluding to. Like, I would buy the whole book just for that one. So like, it's fantastic. And you all know me. I am a cynic with a cold heart when it comes to this kind of stuff. And like, I loved this book. So please check it out.
He did text me, y'all. He said, I cried during most of it. So
I did.
If you want to see what book made Sam Blackwell cry.
For sure. Absolutely.
Yes.
Well, and also because it just like, it took me back to all of these times in our lives together as friends that were like very meaningful and impactful.
How much we've changed over the years. Yeah.
For sure. Absolutely.
I just want to remind everyone that my publisher is offering 15% off to all of our listeners for the month of April. We're going to run ads so that you'll hear this, but it's Just Break Up is the discount code. You can go to buttonpoetry.com and find my book there, or there's a link in my show notes or my social media or my website. If you want to see more of my poetry content, you can find me on YouTube, or I've been posting my poems on my social media to promote obviously the book coming out. Again, it's called Ephemera. And I just want to say thank you to Sam for asking such thoughtful questions and for giving like the best interview of my life. And thank you to our listeners for supporting me, like supporting the other leg of my career. I really love being a podcast host. But poetry is definitely my home where I came from. So thanks for letting me show you around my home.
Absolutely. This is super fun.
Yeah. So go buy Ephemera, go pre-order it. It comes out in June, but it'll be in your mailbox in May. Don't tell my publisher that I told you that. And if all else fails,
just break up.